It's also folded into the Adler Lunch. It's a public lecture sponsored by the Adler family to support sharing of information and knowledge about religion in the public life. And it combines really well, as you can imagine, with the theme that we have for this class. And usually we rotate major themes for the course on human rights. And it happens that this semester, we're focusing on the issue of prison systems and incarceration. And if you follow that topic, probably you're familiar with what just happened on April 12th and 13th. In fact, there was a lawsuit out of Indiana by an inmate who spent 20 days continuously in isolated confinement and passed away. And now his real estate are suing, and we'll see what comes out of it. But despite all of that, we really rarely discuss the issue of prison system and incarceration as a topic of human rights. And that's what we're doing in this class. And that's why we're really happy to have a guest lecturer who spent all his academic career since writing your dissertation, right?
Yeah.
On incarcerated people on the prison system. So we're really happy that, and he has a book coming out this September on the topic. His research bleeds really well into the legal system, into jurisprudence, into law schools, and human rights and religious studies. He PhDs in religious studies, but also by way of sharing with you some facts and figures that will give some emphasis about the importance of this topic. And the last just 3 decades, since 1990s, there were about 408 million persons in the United States who were incarcerated. That if you average that number every year, 12 million people would have been arrested. And out of those 12 million people who would have been arrested, some of them would be tried or they'd plead, and they'll end up 2 million every year on average. It peaked at about 2.3 million just 2 years ago, and the lowest was like 1.8 million. So on average, about 2 million people are living in prison. If you take it in the context of global nation states and communities, it's like a nation within a nation. Many countries, including Lebanon, including that country I come from, some countries are under 2 million in their population. So you can imagine an entire population is incarcerated, living in the prison. And then you can read about the conditions of the people who are incarcerated. And even when they're out, so normally we speak of the justice system when you make the first encounter with a police officer all the way until you're incarcerated. But life for the incarcerated people doesn't end there. And actually, it's even more significant to focus on it and see how we can integrate these communities better and actually just come up with better systems. Also, to put it in a context that normally we talk about human rights, is like some people would like to think that we're discovering things and we are doing better because we know better. We're better human beings, which I don't buy into. Because one of the examples is this: the prison system is one of the oldest systems humans invented. It goes back about 1,000 years. The Egyptians and the Babylonians invented like 1,000 years ago, before the Common Era. And despite all this knowledge we have and these discoveries and the science and everything else, we're still recycling this old system, and we didn't come up with something better, that treats us really as a human being if the focus is about human rights. So with that kind of general introduction, I would like first to, before I introduce and let Dr. SpearIt talk to you, I would like to make sure that I thank Maureen and Robin. These are the people who make events like this happen. Also, I would like to thank our chair in the Department of Religious Studies who made this event and funded this event and made it possible. And of course, thank my department, Department of Religious Studies, for producing things like this to actually discuss the topic of religion as it applied in public life. Dr. SpearIt.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thanks for being here. I want to thank everyone in the Religious Studies Department for sponsoring these talks, the College of Law as well. And also the Iowa community. Professor Swayaya has treated me like royalty, and we've been having these discussions since November to make this talk come out. Is there any way to turn down the mic or whatever's echoing here? Again, I just want to mention that the hospitality has been beyond amazing here. So, and you all have a beautiful campus, and you should be proud to be students here. It's very nice. So what I want to do today is to think about how human rights are implicated throughout the criminal justice process. And even when I say criminal justice system, even when I say that, it's tricky, right? Because lots of scholars and activists are trying to use the term criminal legal system, right, as a way to distinguish criminal justice from what is criminal legal system in terms of, well, where's the justice really? If you really understand that system you're calling criminal justice system, you would know that justice is often conspicuous by its absence, really. So what I want to do is think about how the criminal legal system, thank you for that. It'll make me crazy. I won't even be able to think because it's just like a bad DJ set. Is that my computer? That's my computer. Yeah, so I don't think this is that computer, I think.
Oh, this one?
Yeah. So you could just exit out of there. Okay, great. Thank you. Everything will go much better after. Yes, thank you. Oh, man. In the post-Zoom era, our IT people are like, the fabulous people we need. I used to DJ back in the day, a long time ago. And, when technology screws up, you're there, no sound, or a wire goes bad, it's like, you're there naked before the world. And so thank you, IT people. It's really important. So here's the way we're going to look at this. When we think about the criminal legal system, that's not right. When we think about that, I want us to think about the different stages where we will consider where human rights issues are at play. First, we're going to talk about police encounters, think about conduct on the street by police officers. Then I want to take us to the right to counsel, the ability to obtain a lawyer for your representation. And then I want to talk about punishment, and then thinking about life beyond prison, like what we do to or for people who are exiting prison, and how that brings up human rights issues as well. So when we think about human rights, let's kind of just try to get on the same page with what are we talking about? What's a human right? Can someone help us out? Like, what is a human right? Anybody? No one? Well, that's great. So then let's talk about it, because maybe people aren't really sure. But let me just kind of venture to say that many frameworks think about human rights as a matter of being grounded in dignity, right? Human dignity. That is, you have rights that flow from the fact of you being a human being. That is, that's the dignity part. And then there's also the notion that we're equal before the law, right? Like you and I are not obviously equal, right, in a sort of empirical sense, but before the law, we are equal. And that is another underlying aspect of human rights in the framework. In the United Nations Charter, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's the belief that all people have special value that's just simply tied into being human. It has nothing to do with class, race, gender, etc. Nothing but being human. And so what I want us to recognize is that human rights, the way we're talking about it now, when we think about dignity, dignity didn't always have this meaning. It really had like a kind of a bougie type meaning in the sense that you were a baron, or you had some title of nobility, or you had something that distinguished you from those peasants over there, right? And so dignity meant you were a dignitary, really. And so you had status based on your status, who you were in that society. And that's what gave you your ability to enforce rights, et cetera. But the Declaration of Human Rights and the human rights framework has pretty much flipped that on its head. You don't have to be of royalty. You don't have to be of clergy, right? Everyone gets human rights by virtue of your own morality, by virtue of your own humanity, right? Being human, right? And so this is something that in some way, shape, or form, the world religions have all recognized, right? That humans have some inherent dignity, and that human rights flow from that dignity naturally. At least in the Abrahamic traditions, when we think about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, this idea that humans are made in the image of God, right? That we're like a replica, we're an image of God. And in that sense, there's this type of dignity that flows from that. Even in the Hindu worldview, when you think about the Atman, Paramatma, right? There's this idea that we're all equal in this other metaphysical sense that comes out into the real world, right? And so we've taken some of these ideas, even in our punishment jurisprudence, because in the death penalty context, we talk about the dignity of man, right? The dignity of man is what dictates that when we kill someone, we do it properly, right? So that's how we've used that thus far, but hopefully we're going to push those boundaries. But that's how dignity has come into play in the capital context. We want to make sure someone is dignified when we put that person to death. So you might think that that runs really counter, and it does in some ways, to the idea of human rights. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So if we have a sense of what human rights are, then what are the detractors? What are the things that are not human rights, right? What kind of things do we talk about? What detracts from one's human rights? So if it's dignity, think about what? Humiliation, degradation, alienation, dispossession of your body, right? When someone assaults you or detains you or rapes you or even kills you, killing being the ultimate dispossession of your body, right? Those are detractors of human rights. Those are the things we look at as being antithetical to human rights. And so I want to be thinking about those types of detractors in light of a dignity, equality before the law framework as we go through and really think about our criminal justice system or the legal system, how you want to call it. And so I do want to just lay out a disclaimer. I'm not a scholar of human rights. I haven't really written anything on this area in my whole career. But you'll see the issues I've been dealing with in the punishment system, in law enforcement, all bear directly on human rights. So I've been working in the area kind of without even knowing it, because what we do, what I study, inculcates human rights at multiple levels, as we'll see. So I do want to lay out that little disclaimer. Let's talk about police conduct. And again, we want to think about what implications here, dignity, equality, et cetera, right? So we all know a stop and frisk, what a stop and frisk is. So a police officer can stop you and ask you questions, regardless of whatever's going on. Hey, what's up? How's your day going? Everything cool? You don't have to talk to the police officer. But if the police officer says, I need to talk to you, I'm investigating something, we're suspecting you of committing a crime, that's different. Then there's some reasonable suspicion to stop you. And then to get to this point of frisking, that's another level of suspicion. But so many police departments in this country, Chicago, especially New York, we're stopping and frisking people left and right with no reasonable suspicion whatsoever. And how many people here, just by, maybe it's not fair, but if you care to, how many have ever been stopped and frisked? Yeah, well, I would expect that, but if you think about it, if you've never experienced that, boy, let me talk about a humiliating experience. Let me tell you what, it's not very nice when people are walking by looking at you. It's not nice when you're shaking so hard. Your legs are shaking so hard because you're in this position, right? And so this happens, and one of the major problems with being stopped and frisked and interrogated is that police encounters like that set the conditions for further engagement. So now if they've got some sort of, even if they didn't have reasonable suspicion, they find something on you, right? If you say something incriminating, it may very well lead to probable cause, which can lead to an arrest. So these types of encounters aren't very innocuous when you think about the downstream consequences. Racial profiling, and of course, this horrific killing of Ronald Green. If you don't know about this case, do not watch the video if you don't want to have nightmares. If you don't want to hear somebody screaming out Jesus's name, right, for the beating and the killing he's taken for no other reason, he got pulled over, right? And so this is one of the most, I've seen a lot of stuff in my time, and this is one of the most horrific ones. So there's, killings and beatings, even detainment. Sandra Bland, with this thing that happened in Texas, she got pulled over and eventually got dragged out of her car for some parking violation, or I'm sorry, some transportation violation. And then she ends up dead few days later in her cell. And lots of issues around that type of thing happening. And it happens pretty frequently, as the professor was saying, people can get incarcerated or even jailed and end up dying because of conditions in the jail or the treatment of the staff in jail. So these kinds of things, and try to recognize, George Floyd and Philando Castile and Oscar Grant and all of these killings that we've seen, we're just getting to see some of the stuff that's been happening forever, but now we got cameras and we can see things. And so George Floyd kind of kicks off this new era of police-oriented reform. But we can also think about, what do you think about this idea when Michael Brown was killed in St. Louis, right, in Ferguson? What happened to his body? Does anyone know? Do you know? So his body laid out there, a dead body, blood coming from the head, laid out there for 4 hours in the sun. And police wouldn't even let the family come and tend to the body. Now, again, I'm not the human rights guru, but that seems like a gross violation of some people's religious beliefs and just the dignity that I'm trying to get across. Not just the dignity of the person who's laying there, but the family of this individual can't get to the body. 4 hours you're looking at your child there, and the police will not let you through. These are the kind of issues that I think raise significant human rights issues. And I just feel, I teach criminal law, I teach criminal procedure. Criminal procedure is the law that governs police. So what the police can and can't do. And so I can speak all day on the type of misconducts that lead to human rights violations if we think about dignity and equality, et cetera. And of course, the equality issue is not everybody gets stopped and frisked. These police officers in New York and Chicago, they were focusing on the minority neighborhoods. They weren't even in the sort of wealthier minority neighborhoods. They were in poor minority neighborhoods, creating hotspots. And so it's not that, the people from Wall Street were getting shaken down and that sort of thing, even though it's a fact that people commit crimes in equal proportions, regardless if you're high or low class, right? And so we could talk more about that, but I'm happy to entertain questions and to think about this more. Now, one of the sort of premier rights to think about is, what right do you have to enforce other rights, right? Or what ability do you have to, because we talk about the right to counsel in criminal procedure as being the mother of all rights, or sort of the kingpin of all rights, because without a lawyer, it's hard to enforce all of the rights that you do have. And so it's critical. All those rights and sort of constitutional rights that you have, or privileges, et cetera, can all be stripped away if you don't have someone to help you enforce the right. And so not having right to counsel leads to tons of false confessions. If you haven't seen the book, The Process is the Punishment by Malcolm Feely, check out that book. It's all about people who confess falsely to crimes simply to get out of the criminal justice system, simply to get out. I've got kids at home, I'm in jail. I've got a job to get back to, I've got to pay this, I've got to get back to my life. I will take this plea bargain just so I can get back to my life, right? And so false confessions happen quite a bit just to get out of the system. I would rather take the misdemeanor on my record than have to spend another, 4 or 5 months in prison, or in jail rather. Those are problems. Plea bargaining. Sometimes even when you get counsel, it's like you don't have counsel. Why? Because we like to think that our legal system is like a zero-sum game. Your lawyer is going to duke it out Mayweather style against the other and going to win for you, right? That's what you think is going to happen. No. Lots of times people go into the courtroom or go into the litigation expecting to make a handshake and make a deal. They go in expecting to make a deal, not to fight for you, but to just get you off their docket. Public defenders have enormous workloads and they don't get paid very much. They don't get much money for investigation for your case. And so for them, they're just trying to get the case disposed, on to the next. And so unfortunately, this this has really almost killed the trial completely. We like to think about a trial and before a jury and before a judge. Almost no criminal cases get disposed of that way. At the federal level, only about 2% of cases actually go to trial. Everything else gets plea bargain. Everything else gets, it's a deal, it's a handshake that gets made between the prosecution and the defense, right? And so without having counsel as well, you don't know what other constitutional rights you're giving up, right? A right to a jury trial, for example, et cetera. So without a right to counsel, and I believe that this is where a lot of the trouble for people in the criminal legal system really begins, is that they either don't have viable counsel, or the counsel that they get is overworked, trying to make a deal. And so for those of you who know, not everybody gets this guy, right? Not everybody gets this guy who's willing to go to the ends for R. Kelly, right? So public defenders are kind of, unfortunately, in a different situation than someone that you can pay top dollar to. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, back to the equality issue, justice shouldn't depend on how much money you have in your pocket, but our system, unfortunately, is built around a financial model. And so people can get off, if you have the money, to hire a staff of attorneys to get you through, right? So all kinds of implications here, but really the downstream consequences. One of the things that you should know, that when you do a plea bargain, lots of times that forecloses any opportunity to appeal your case. You are saying, I did it, give me the punishment, no possibility of appeal. Let's talk about punishment itself, getting back to dignity and equality. Our punishment system really, okay. So when the way we punish is almost, like the professor was saying, it's almost otherworldly by this day and age. So when you come into prison, what's the first thing that's not very pleasant that happens to you? Anybody know? Has anyone ever been strip searched in this room? Like, okay, plug your ears in. I don't want to rehash stuff, but it's not very nice. Bend over, spread your cheeks, lift your sack, spread the lips. Like, I'm serious. This is what people do just to get into prison, right? If you ever get transferred in a prison, then you have maybe 3 or 4 of these types of strip searches that happen. And just sort of by measure, I'm not sure if you're aware, but if you get arrested by the police and you go get booked in a station house, what can those police officers do to you? Same thing. They can strip search you before they put you in the holding cell. You can be strip searched. But wait a second, I didn't commit any crime. It was proved. You all let me go. I didn't commit any crime. Doesn't matter. Anybody who ever has to get put in a holding cell, the police have a right to strip search you, even if they screwed up, even if it was their mistake. All right, that's how badly we want to keep contraband out of jails, is that we will subject people to this type of treatment. And so we get to also issues of solitary confinement being the alienation of someone to the highest degree, putting people alone in cells. They lose sense of contact, their sensory deprivation, and start talking to themselves because there's no one else to talk to. And then in the most, in decompensation, in those stages, you start carving on your body and using things to cut yourself up, cutting your genitals and scarring your body, these sorts of things. When Malcolm X, wrote about him being in solitary, he was just banging his head against the wall, right? And so these are things that happen in this system of punishment, which in California, for example, there's Pelican Bay, which is only solitary confinement. Every single cell there is solitary confinement. So we've built a cottage industry around this idea that it's a good idea to put people in solitary, which we've known since the beginning drives people crazy. In prison, there's rampant sexual and gender violence. I've done study, I've written on this, and of course, there's the human rights issue of having yourself violated. And when I say sexual and gender violence, I'm talking also prostitution, forced sex slavery, right? The difference being, at least as a prostitute, you can make some money. As a slave, you're somebody's. And so there's no money to be made, all the way to forced families where you're the daddy and you create a family, right? And so these are other issues that bear on human rights. But one other thing to think about, when people who've been sexually assaulted in prison come out of prison, our government has done studies, the United States government has done studies to suggest one of the ways to regain masculinity, which got taken away in prison, do we know what that is? Do we have a sense of I'm talking men specifically, not to say that women don't get sexually assaulted in prison. Don't take me for saying that. But for men, how do men regain masculinity? Any sense what they might do? They go out and assault someone else, right? This is like empirical evidence that this is one way to get back into the game, is to rape someone else, right? Pass that along and regain your manhood. So not only are we talking about the initial violation of the person, but the person or persons that individual is going to violate. In the prison system, there's no such thing as the Fourth Amendment when it comes to your prison cell, which means they can come in and shake down your cell for no reason at all, right? So again, how this gets abused, people's lives get turned upside down, etc. One of the brilliant things our prison system does is it enforces our punishment system, really. And sometimes we just never really think about this. So imagine when you get a 3 to 5 year sentence, underlying that 3 to 5 year sentence is a sentence of celibacy. I mean, just think about that. That's a part of the punishment. And there's no way around it, because sexual relations with other people, even consensual in prison, forbidden. Condoms, forbidden. Conjugal visits, forbidden, forbidden, forbidden. There's even in some prison systems, there's punishment, additional punishment for masturbation. So within that punishment frame, there's an imposition of celibacy that we think is a great idea. Yes, let's further alienate a person from his or her sexuality. In addition, my area of thinking about prisons has been long to think about Muslims in prison, and to think about how historically Muslims have been repressed since really the 50s was really bad, in the 60s. So religious repression, again, is another type of violation that occurs, because you're essentially stripping a person from the ability to worship, to have free exercise. And not just that, but we know that religion helps rehabilitation. So we're depriving someone of something that can actually help improve that person's life. Do want to sort of recognize that. Please sit down, enjoy, just relax. There's lots of seating. I hate to see you standing. Thanks. Yeah, so religious liberty, we have to look at that as a fundamental human right, universal human right, that does get swiped away when, for example, Martin Sostre, for example, Thomas X. Cooper. These are documented cases of people being thrown into solitary confinement just for claiming to be Muslim, just for wanting to have freedom as a Muslim to worship, right? And so here's some images just to give us some punctuation on the punishment system that we roll with, right? Spit masks, right? On people who are on suicide watch. We just basically mummify people and throw them in a room that doesn't have anything, because we don't want them to use something to kill themselves. So we're going to torture someone just to keep them alive, which is, I got a sick sense of humor, but we torture someone just to keep the person alive, right? Here in Texas, this individual got fired from, the correctional force because for doing this, shooting gas canisters directly at people. This happened a couple of years back in Texas. Leaked footage came out. And so the person who took this footage got kicked off the force as well, right? So naturally. If you hadn't seen Most Deaf or Yasin Bey, who did a video recording of him trying to endure force feeding. It was in protest. I can't remember if he was in protest of Guantanamo Bay's force feeding or it was in protest of the force feeding going on in California. In California, they had a hunger strike. And so if you haven't seen this, this is another one to check out. He couldn't finish the other nostril. They got down one nostril. When they tried to do the second, he was done, crying in front of the world. He just underwent this, which was just unbelievable. But yeah, prisons in California, when they had the hunger strike, imagine that people in prison, Muslims included, were signing non-resuscitation forms. In other words, if I die, don't resuscitate me. I want to die. I'm fasting to death, right? And so the state did not honor those requests and still force-fed people who were trying to fast to death. And so you don't even have that kind of autonomy, right? When you want to will your life away through fasting or some other form of protest, no way, says the state. George Steiny, the youngest American ever killed by the death penalty, who was 13 years old, little kid crying when they stuck the helmet on him. This is our system, just so that we know. We killed 13-year-old Alabama recently killed a 70-something-year-old man. I mean, he walks with 2 canes. What's this person going to do to our, it's one of those things where it's really difficult to think how that person hasn't aged out of criminality. But so on the far end of age and in the shallow end of age, right, we have these situations. The American Bar Association, which accredits the law school that is on this campus, says in its treatment of prisoners' standards, in Standard 23.1, says correctional authorities should respect the human rights and dignity of prisoners. No prisoner should be subjected to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or conditions, right? And so ABA accredits, so we give them lots of respect, lots of props, and we make a statement like this, all kinds of credit. But when it comes to, right, fulfilling these kinds of words, prisons are just, sort of nowhere to be found in terms of this type of treatment. So those are the aspirations, but what happens in reality is a different story. I'd be happy to talk more. This is kind of my bread and butter, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. Now, when you're in prison, try to recognize how difficult it is to do anything. Over 50% of all people in prison who are married experience divorce within a few years, right? Over 50%. So if you're married going into prison, you're going to get divorced pretty soon, right? And so how do you access justice when you're in prison? Now, we're out here, sending a text, making a phone call, sending an email, jumping on Zoom, even sending a fax. Y'all know what a fax is? Not like something's true, not like a fact, but facts, a fax machine. Well, none of that's really available. So try to imagine trying to either fight your criminal case or trying to make a civil rights claim, right? You're in solitary confinement. How do you get anything done in solitary confinement? You're by yourself for 23.5 hours a day until you can go outside and exercise for a bit, usually by yourself as well, but you get to see people along the way. Big problems in terms of accessing justice. Back in the day of Martin Sostre, people would get put in solitary confinement for helping other people with their case, to write a petition, a habeas petition to try to get out of prison, etc. So people would get punished severely. Mumia Abu-Jamal, who wrote this book, Jailhouse Lawyers, said, marshals some statistics to show that people who helped other people in prison were some of the most severely punished people in prison, right? In that book, Jailhouse Lawyers, right? So we have this situation where, you kind of might feel ambivalent about other people in prison helping, their fellows, because you got people like this, people who don't know anything about the law, but who are just kind of scamming, versus people like Martin Sostre, who knows more about prison law than I ever will. I mean, this guy had multiple litigation on multiple fronts, solitary confinement, trying to worship religion, getting medications, etc. Mumia Abu-Jamal as well, probably the most famous person in an American prison, right? Muslim individual who has been really outspoken on this topic. And of course, the Columbia Human Rights Law Review puts this out, understanding that having proper representation is a human right. The right to counsel is something that implicates all sorts of human rights issues. I do want to emphasize a couple of things, again, about the equality piece. People in prison have different hurdles to cross in order just to bring a claim in federal court. And this is not something you would have to do, for example, or you would have to do. If you want to file a claim in federal court, you just pay the money and you file a claim, right? People in prison, it doesn't work like that. There is what's known as the Prison Litigation Reform Act, PLRA, which puts all kinds of hurdles for someone who's in a penitentiary or imprisonment situation just to get to federal court, right? There's restrictions on the lawyer fees that a lawyer can earn for you. You have to exhaust all the administrative remedies that there are. So in other words, you have to go and tell on the people who are guarding you, your guards, tell on the guards that see you day in and day out every day to the prison. You have to go tell on them. The people who watch you every day, now they know, and you're oftentimes going to be it happens a lot. They retaliate against you. They're pissed off. You're giving them a yellow slip in their file. And this is not very, if things were not so great to begin with, you've made things very much worse for yourself by filing a grievance with the prison in order to get some remedy. But you can't get to federal court unless you file that grievance. And you can't get to federal court unless you follow the dictates of the PLRA. If you're looking for habeas corpus relief, you have to also clear the hurdles of the AEDPA law, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which puts further restrictions in place. And what I'm trying to say is that in terms of equality, people in prison have to go through far much more than we do to file the same claim. If you want to file a free exercise claim, for example, and someone in prison wants to do the same, they have to go through much more than you do, right? They have to go through much more. And if they're wrong 3 times, you're never going to get hurt again, right? If you lose 3 times, right, there's the 3 strikes provision in the PLRA. You're out of luck permanently, right? So these are some of the issues that affect people in prison in terms of accessing justice. Now, I got one more for you. So let's say you've jumped through the exhaustion remedies with the prison. You've managed to get a lawyer or help to file a claim. You scraped up the money to file, and you have an injunction. You're trying to ask the court, please stop the prison from putting me in solitary confinement. That's the claim, right? Or please stop them from doing this or that. Well, here's the thing. In some instances, what the prison can do is just up and transfer you, get you out of that unit, right? So they can do some wrongdoing and then turn around and transfer you out of that unit. And what does that do? Is that kills that claim for injunction, for injunctive relief. It kills it. Why? Because they say that person is no longer suffering that violation at that facility, so we're going to dismiss this claim, right? So just try to imagine that. Your life just got flipped upside down because they transferred you. That means all your stuff has to follow you. If you have mail, that has to follow you. Medications, you may be taking some sort of therapy or counseling, religious programming, educational, all of that's done. You may have a job, established goodwill, all of that's, and you've got to go be the new kid on the block again, the cell block, right? And so Your whole life gets turned upside down. And on top of that, the end result is that your case gets dismissed. Just try to imagine that. Your case gets dismissed. So we're talking multiple levels of injustice. One, the initial wrongdoing done against the person, the initial wrongdoing. And then two, transferring that individual to cover up the wrongdoing legally. And then three, no one is ever brought to justice for that wrongdoing. What do you think number 4 is? What injustice number 4 is that prison is still able to continue the wrongdoing. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? That prison can continue doing the wrongdoing. All they got to do is just transfer someone out, ship someone out. And that claim for injunctive relief can be mooted, is what they say. That's the word. It's the doctrine of mootness. It moots the case. So trying to recognize sort of the hardships that someone in prison endures just to access justice. And I want you to just recognize that this happens in 2023 United States of America, that someone can have a viable claim before a federal court and have it exterminated or just have that dismissed just because prisons know that they can have that thing dismissed by transferring you. And you're stuck having gone through all those hurdles, spent that money, done everything required to get into federal court. Now you're left holding nothing. You have nothing left. This thing is determined for me to log in as a UI guest, wireless. It is relentless, right? I wish my students were like this in their study because, wow, this thing. Okay. Now let's move on and think about after imprisonment, which obviously still involves the criminal legal system. You may be on parole from the prison system, parole meaning a suspended sentence you get coming out of prison, as opposed to probation is the sentence that they suspend in court, which means you avoid going to jail in the first place. So there's a difference between, a suspended sentence coming from prison, which is called parole, versus a suspended sentence at your, at the end of your trial at sentencing, which is probation. But both involve people in the system, right? Correctional officers, parole officers, et cetera. So you have to deal with some of those issues. If you, for example, were a young kid and you sent, maybe just playing around, sent a nasty picture to another person, or even a 1 year difference from the statutory law, maybe you're a 17-year-old and sent something to you could be liable for child pornography. And child pornography are some of the stiffest laws in the country. Some of the harshest laws in our country are anti-child pornography laws. But what does that mean for the 17-year-old who was just goofing around? It means a lifetime of registration. In some places, it means on your yard saying a sex offender lives here. Sometimes on your car, depends where you live, right? But there are all these markers that are trying to, show that this person is untrustable or this person you need to watch out for is a sex offender. So there's that humiliation, right? That alienation that we tried to talk about before. In general, anybody who has an F, that fire, that felony on your record, you have a world of trouble coming ahead of you just by having a felony on your record. So we can talk about what some of those things are, but really we're talking about how scarlet letters work in the present. This is a scarlet letter, right? You get asked, have you ever been convicted? You gotta check that box, right? That means you just didn't get the job practically. And so having to deal with the scarlet letter and being excluded by that, we also have what are called legal financial obligations that attend, which mean they're called LFOs, legal financial obligations. And so you could have a situation where between restitution and other fees and costs, someone convicted of a crime could be going down for maybe 5 years and owe like $40,000. And in some jurisdictions, you start getting charged interest on the day of conviction, right? The day of sentencing. When you're sentenced, you start accumulating interest. In some places in Washington State and I believe Arizona, it was like 12%. So you had people going into prison with 40,000 debt coming out worse than your education loans. They're owing like 80, 90,000 in debt. And of course, people who come out of prison are the least employable people. They take on jobs that have the highest turnover rate. And so the thought that they're ever going to make enough money to pay off that debt, it's almost like, sort of fantasy thinking, because they're never going to be able to pay off that debt in many instances. So we have this legal financial obligation system that can keep someone in a type of financial indentured servitude or something like that to the state, right? You owe money to the state. It keeps compounding interest and you're never going to get out of it. It's like a type of financial slavery that comes from being a felon and having spent time in prison. Lastly, a part of these consequences that attend someone who's been convicted of a crime are all of these things that we call collateral consequences. A collateral consequence is a civil law. It's a civil law, not a criminal law, that is triggered by a conviction. So even if you plead guilty and you have a plea bargain or you're convicted before a jury in trial, both are the same. You get a conviction on your record. And because now you have a felony, for example, a whole bunch of other civil laws kick in. They're triggered by your conviction. And that's what's known as collateral consequences. And so this could mean you get deported, collateral consequence. Certain student loans you're not going to be able to apply for. Certain licenses. At the federal level, federal legislation says that if you're convicted of a felony, you can't have certain licenses, for example. You can't get a broadcast license. You can't get a license to drive an airplane, for example, right? So these kinds of rules that are out there, you can't live in certain places, or you can't get certain types of housing welfare. And then, of course, as we mentioned, there's that terrible box, right? Have you been convicted of a crime? Or, asking for your criminal background and history, registered sex offender. You can't vote in many jurisdictions, right? At last count, it was almost like 6 million Americans can't vote just because they've been convicted of a crime. But then you ask, well, did the crime involve voting or something with the election? No, just everybody gets disenfranchised, which to me is very interesting in a country that really, sort of prides itself on democracy being the backbone. But in this country, you can lose the right to vote very quickly. And the people who are losing the right to vote are people who have historically had a hell of a time trying to vote, right? So this is one of the most effective ways of keeping people from voting, is to tie a criminal conviction to it. And then, of course, this may be the only benefit of a conviction, is just like not having to go to jury duty, but that's also, but it is really, it's very nefarious. And another thing is that you may think it's strange, but for all this talk about the Second Amendment in this country, if you're convicted of a felony, I don't care what the felony is. It could be I'm from, coming from Texas, and you could have ridiculous things that get you a felony. In Massachusetts, you can have a firearm, and because you don't have an ID card for it, firearm's legal, but the fact you don't have an ID card, felony, means you can never possess a firearm for the rest of your life. You can't rectify that with the state because it's a federal law. So even if you committed a state felony, the federal law kicks in, because if it says if you've committed any state or federal felony, you no longer can have a gun for the rest of your life. Right? Those are some of the things. Now, we laugh when we say the jury duty, you get alleviated from that responsibility, but try to think about what this really means, because I think it's important, because we're talking about rights and we're talking about human rights, but let's break this down for a second, because we're talking about disenfranchising people from participating in the system that we want to integrate them to. We want to integrate them to our system. Okay, so don't let them vote and kick them out of the political process. Not very great idea, but there's more pragmatic critiques of this. And here's what I'm trying to get at, is that we have judges, lawyers, and legislators who write really long penalties for crimes in this country, such that, 25 to life is a pretty normative proposition. We have 3 strikes legislation in many jurisdictions federally. And so we don't have a problem with putting someone away for life. So we have these legislators and we have these judges who are creating these laws, adjudicating them, and then sentencing these people for huge amounts of time. Now, let's ask the question, how many of any of those people have spent one night in a prison? Oh, cut the dumps, let's just say a jail. How many of them have ever spent one night in a jail, the very place that they're sending people to for these ungodly amounts of time? And talking about hemispherical justice, we dole out the harshest sentences in the world. We have no business pointing to North Korea, Iran, or anywhere else in the world when in this country, we're laying it thick on people we convict of crimes. And so those people know very little about the internal workings of the punishment system, but they're making all the rules and determining who goes there. Meanwhile, the people who come out of prison, who know the most about how the system works and how corrupt it is and how dangerous and abusive it is, we silence them. Can't change the political process, the laws, the policies, and you can't prevent the state from taking one of your fellow brethren and sistren to jail either. So we disenfranchise people who know some of the most stuff about the criminal legal system, and we give all the power to judges and lawyers and legislators. And so to me, that's like upside down policy. If you think about it, we got it backwards. We should be allowing people who know to have a voice, but that's where we are in our system. Well, I'm going to stop here and say thank you very much for your time and attention. I usually get a lot of yawns in it's like fish kind of bubbling up, but I didn't get too many. So thank you very much for that. I look forward to your comments and your questions, anything, really. Thank you. So comment, yes, please.
Your lecture yesterday, could you comment about the human rights status of underage offenders and how especially interfaces with minorities, in other words, Native Americans, African Americans, Hispanic Americans?
How the juvenile status?
Yes, as a human rights issue, because it seems to me since the 80s, there's been much over-incarceration of minorities being charged with adult crimes and not being sent to juvenile court.
Yeah,
probably most likely should.
Yeah, so I don't think I can. When you say what's the human rights status, I'm not sure I could say, but it feels like a lot, in terms of, and it really reminds me of. I just watched this piece of Dave Chappelle who brings up this exact point where, we have, say, a young white girl who goes missing and the freaking whole world freaks out and it's not her fault. And he talks about it this way. But then we have a individual, black male, same age, who commits a crime. It's an adult for criminal legal purposes. And so we do have a double standard that exists when it comes to people of a younger age, because we tend to hold and I just want to say, we tend to hold Black men much more accountable than any other group, right? And so in that sense, the equality issues really kind of come to surface. But, there's been other kind of complaints in addition to the way, like the stand your ground laws, self-defense in Florida implicated, people of juvenile age, the Zimmerman issue. Yes. And there's also claims that many of the school systems and the way they deal with minority youth tend to create what they call the pipeline programs to prison, right? And so they've been, sort of some of these schools that are saying, look, you can't wear any kind of shirts, you have to wear this type of uniform day in and day out, have been likened to uniforms in prison. And in other words, we're trying to get these people ready. And I just you know, there was the Kids for Cash, you know, scandal that happened in Pennsylvania, where the judge there was taking money. You know, should look up this. I mean, he made, you know, at least a couple million doing that. Okay, sure. So the question was about juvenile human rights violation. And so in that case, all kinds of kids, just, you know, just really good kids got sent to prison, got sent to juvenile for trumped up charges. And again, you know, that's the kind of thing where there's such a strong profit motive. So here was the setup. I'm the judge. Here's the private juvenile facility. Hey, judge, we'll pay you behind the scenes if you fill up our private prison. And so there's such a profit motive that you know, the juvenile, the youth of the offenders, just nobody really cared about that. But I think you're hitting on an important issue, especially with the age and being able to be tried as an adult versus a youth. But socially, we seem to find a lot more flexibility when it comes to youth of other races, right, of other social statuses. But thank you for that. And thank you for showing yesterday as well. Appreciate that. Yes, please.
So I have a question. Actually, I have a few questions on the same topic. So remember when you talked about being in prison, how you get treated inside the prison? So I'm from outside the country, so I don't know that much about the law here. But let's say you have a lot of money, or you're the son of a senator, somebody high in the country, and you're convicted by a felony, like really big one, and you had to go to the prison. Do you get treated the same way? I mean, this is, of course, there's a stuff of common sense. Yeah, of course, because your father or your mother higher up, you might not get treated the same.
Sure.
But I want to know, like, how are you actually going to get treated?
It's a good question. I think we're about to see that maybe with the former president, where someone of that status might end up having to go if, in fact, there's some sort of conviction. Maybe not. So the question, I'm sorry, is that do all people get treated the same by the justice system when it comes to punishment? And you know, the short answer is no. Money and privilege and power have a lot to do with it in terms of prison is not a one size fits all in this country. We don't have just one type of prison and everybody goes to that, or you don't go to prison at all. It's not like that. Instead, what we have is prisons with different levels of security, right? Different levels of security. And so you've heard of Club Fed, for example, right? Club Fed being like the most chill federal prisons there are. Other state prisons have work furlough. Other places will let you just go home for chunks of time. And so depending on how many strings you can pull, you could end up getting a situation like that. And here's the other kind of linchpin to your question. Remember when I was talking about transfers and mootness and how that works? Well, what are the restrictions on prisons transferring an individual, right? And when you look at that question, which I've looked at, and we can all look at it, it's a Supreme Court decision that says that's the prison's business. We're not going to second guess what goes on in a prison. So when it comes to a prison transfer, an involuntary transfer, the Supreme Court has said that's the prison's business. We're not going to interfere. If they have to do it for punishment reasons, we'll let them do it for punishment reasons, or if they have to do it just for administrative reasons. That's why in some places you hear the phrase administrative segregation, meaning we're segregating you, but it's just because, you know, you're a gay inmate and you have told on some people, so we're going to protect you by throwing you in administrative segregation, which is just a fancy word for solitary confinement. So there's no restriction on where a prison can place you in that hierarchy of harsher prisons to the Club Fed. There's no restriction. So if you know the right people, you could go to Club Fed rather than San Quentin State Prison, for example. Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, our system, as we tried to show on the right to counsel, justice is largely dependent on how much financial resource you have. Even if you're convicted and you're put in prison, to fight your conviction through appeals and all that. If you have resources, even those types of jobs are far easier than someone who's poor, for example. But, we don't really have to sort of look too deeply into this, because the common denominator in prison is not race. The common denominator in prison is class. Class is overwhelmingly what determines whether you're going to go to prison. Racial considerations, et cetera, that's also a huge part. But the common factor among people in prison is that they're poor, right? So thank you for that.
What do you mean by class?
Financial status, your financial status. If you have money to fight the case in the first place, or even if you're convicted, continue fighting that case, or to try to get out on parole, et cetera. Because look, even the issue of parole, if you think about it, we have homie from the hood, few prospects, low education, versus someone who is, got some education, comes from a well. If you're the parole board, who do you think they're more likely to let out? The person who's going to go back to a stable household, and it only makes sense in some ways. But that's another way that class advantages people over others. Yeah, please.
You mentioned the punishment for child pornography being some of the hardest in the country. I know the country has continued with several other sex offenses, and historically, sex offenses have been punished in the prison system by both administrators for people and inmates as being disproportionate in the hierarchy of crime. So there are some specific changes or different sort of aspects that need to be addressed to specifically recognize the human rights of sex offenders.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, so do you want to talk about the pornography contract or the sex offense contract? Sure. Okay, so yeah, that's a hard thing. It's hard because there are some cases that are just horrific and gruesome, and if you study like Kennedy v. Louisiana, which is just a horrific case. And so let me get to that in a second, but let me just at least lay out the status of sex offense law, right? So in this country, rape had historically been the involuntary intercourse with a woman, not your wife, right? That was the initial common law understanding. There was no such thing as rape against your spouse. It was impossible, right? Spouse was property in those times, right? And so you couldn't rape your spouse. In the time of slavery, there was no such thing as rape against a slave because they were property. And in many ways, that's how slavers increased the population, because historically, you had always taken on the status of your father, which was if your father was free, then you were free. But in slavery, in the time of slavery, many jurisdiction states, they flip that on its head and say, no, the law is that you take on the legal status of your mother. And what did that allow? It allowed for widespread rape against female slaves. In some instances, you had some slaves that had given birth to more than 40 kids, right? Because we're trying to create a workforce, right? It's way better than spending $3,000 or $4,000 on a slave coming on the ship. Create your own workforce. We changed the law so that, and so when you think about some of these, when you hear this term thrown around called rape culture, we have a rape culture in this country. If you look at the way marriage laws were designed, right? You couldn't rape your wife. Or you look at how slaves were treated, which was just unleashed sexual assaults. We come from that culture. Things are changing now with the way we define sexual offenses. It used to be that there was no possibility of a man experiencing a rape. That's changed too because of the language. We used to say vaginal intercourse was literally written in some of the statutes. That's been removed now. So they'll talk about any kind of, sort of touching of this and that. And so it could be male or female organs. So we've changed some of the verbiage such that now men have protection. And, I wish I had a better answer for your question, because in the prison context, it's like a joke sometimes to politicians. I've seen it with my eyes. Politicians talk about someone who's been, or, has been convicted, and is talking, saying on the microphone, a hot mic to the public, saying, well, he's going to have a big bubble waiting in his cell, and then he's going to, you know, he on like, so there's like this joke, don't pick up the soap, right? Date with the health inspector, that you are likely to suffer a sexual assault. And so if a man is ever going to face a sexual assault, it's far more likely to happen in prison than anywhere else, right? So then in some places, it's been estimated that upwards of 20 to 30% of the entire inmate population has experienced some form of sexual assault. And again, you know, that could translate, you know, into, you know, millions of people over time. You know, lots of people leave the justice system and come in on a yearly. It's a huge, huge process. So widespread sexual assault, widespread sex slavery, which means they just use you, widespread prostitution. All of these can be framed as the types of sexual assaults, forced families as well. So we have that. We have guards that sometimes arrange these things. They're called booty bandits, where a known sexual predator gets put in the room, in the same cell with someone they want to punish. Booty bandits. So this is arranged, kind of like gladiator fights, but sexual in nature. So they arrange these sorts of things. And then at the same time, you have the individuals, and this is now, by the time we're talking the way gangs use violence, it's no longer sexual violence, but it's gender violence, because they're using it to prove a political point. They're doing it to send a message to their rivals, right? And so, you know, from the outside, we tend to think that's, you know, homosexuality products. No, it's not. It's the affirmation of masculinity. When a man penetrates another man, that's not gay, that's not homosexual. That's the epitome of masculinity in a place like prison. So then the million-dollar question is, sexual assaults, sex slavery, all this stuff going on, how many convictions have there been for sexual assault given these hundreds of thousands of rapes that we've seen? And we're talking with some of these individuals, it's not just a rape or an assault. Under some of these conditions, if you're a forced prostitute, 7-8 tricks a day. So so we may know how many, you know, as you know, a general matter, how many people may be assaulted, but we don't know how many times. That just is an elusive figure. We don't know about this kind of stuff. So then back to your question, how many people get prosecuted for that? I know of one case that where an individual actually got prosecuted. And so on the first hand, we really have a problem with sex offending in general. Now, and you've got to excuse me because I get off on these. And the question was how to kind of rehabilitate the offenders or the people who have been violated.
So I know that historically, like the treatment of pedophilia was with electrical shock therapy, how long before burden therapy much earlier than was the reduced use of the prison system. So I'm interested in knowing what the human rights aspect of a more humane treatment of like this capital hierarchical crime in the prison culture.
Yeah, well, you know, at the very, very far end, we have people who want to undergo voluntary castration, these sorts of things. You know, sort of getting more into the moderate. You know, there's been other types of, psychiatric therapy, drug therapy, and you know, all of that. The other thing I just wanted to mention was with the victims themselves being counselors. There's some literature about that as well that I've come across, is that as a sort of therapeutic thing, as a person who has that kind of experience, that background, that they can help other people. And through that, it's kind of like the antithesis of what I was trying to say about the offender has to go out, or the victim who has to go out and offend someone else to gain the manhood. This would be a much more, I guess, docile way or more acceptable and salutary way of doing it. But I'll think more about it. If something pops up, I might just yell it out. So thank you. Please.
How much you covered and scholarly courage to look at. I'm wondering if there are effective strategies to draw on the free exercise clause intervening in the criminal legal system. And I'm thinking not just in terms of drawing on it to facilitate the religious bias of people who are in prison, but are there like broader strategies for participating in abolition or participating in effective interventions in the criminal legal system that draw on free exercise as a resource? And the reason I'm asking, if my question doesn't make sense, is I know that recently in reproductive justice movements, although often the free exercise of religion is to justify restriction of abortion access, there are movements now that draw on free exercise to actually, ensure that people have access to it.
Right.
Does something like that work?
So a couple of things. Yeah, historically, that has been one of the things that I study is Muslims who sue for civil rights, and it's a long history. One that has been implemented strategically from the outside. Nation of Islam, CARE, other organizations have done this kind of impact and strategic litigation based on religious rights. I'm going to quibble for a second, because when you say free exercise, you're referring to a constitutional claim where it's not a very robust protection like we would think. So for those of you who are aware, there are statutes like the RFRA, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and the RLUPA, which are statutory provisions and laws. There are laws that provide more robust protection for the First Amendment than even the Constitution does. So if you're in prison trying to prove an RLUPA claim, it's just it's a strict scrutiny. The courts have to look at that with strict scrutiny. Whereas the First Amendment, using a constitutional free exercise, it's just rational basis review. So it's a much harder claim to prove. So at least in the First Amendment context, statutes offer you more protection. So strategically, you have people who are going for the statutory claims more than anything, and sometimes pairing them up with the constitutional claims, because you can get money from a constitutional claim, and that constitutional claim can also survive the mootness question for a transfer. So there are strategies that people are using together, but First Amendment is very weak. And so we almost always see those kinds of claims paired. But I would say both on the inside, jailhouse lawyering movements, and on the outside, they're in one case, the court says, something's up here, because these claims are coming in and they all look very uniform. They all look like something's going on. I think there's some sort of organization or something behind it. This is a court, and he was right? Because that's what was going on. And so there is this, but it's happening from the outside. Say, for example, Muslim advocates. All they do is litigate, basically. They're litigating and doing impact litigation and, First Amendment claims. And so they've strategically, and CARE. So for example, CARE has been, in the last few years, really instrumental in changing the rules of hijab when it comes to jails and booking, that sort of thing. Because before, they would just basically rip off the headdress, take a picture, and just, they don't care who was around. And so now that has happened, but that was all strategic. So it's happening for different issues on different grounds. Please.
So within the context of Islam, it's actually interesting, because within this lifetime, people can do a lot of bad crime and get partial penalties, but Allah will sentence people to eternity in hell for unbelief, which is
So say that last
for
part.
disbelief. Like, you didn't believe in him. What I'm saying is, within Islam, he'll send you to hell for all eternity if you didn't believe in him.
Okay.
I'm just saying it's interesting. Like these prison punishments can seem unfair, but I'm saying, do you think that God's punishment is unfair, eternity in hell?
Yeah. No. I mean, if you think about, when you think about punishment. Yeah.
Can we pause for a minute?
Sure. Oh. People got to go, or?
Yeah, if they can go, then.
Oh, okay, continue. Okay, good. So if you got to bounce, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
This is the door class. Let me know.
Pin?
No, they're tech off mute.
Sorry. That was my note. That's fine. Thanks.
Do you have an answer to that question?
Not at all. I was thinking, well, it's like, look, what the difference in terms of the levels of punishment is that from my understanding as a theological person, is that God's infallible.
Yeah.
We aren't. Therefore, we have to put tempers on the way we punish because we are not perfect. And therefore, we have to be more careful. That's what I would suggest is a good reason to think about.
Yeah, because I wouldn't. So,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate
You
it.
do academic theory religion. So are you not a practitioner of the religion, but you did